Hello, everyone, and welcome. It looks like we've got everyone coming in through the waiting room now, so we will get started. My name is Christine Talon. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, studying pediatric physiology under longtime NASPEM member Dr. Alan McManus. Before we get started here, I would like to acknowledge that the land where I study, play, and call home is the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Syilx Okanagan people, and I'm grateful to be a visitor to this land and for the opportunities that it presents to me. This is the first of 3 research forums to come this spring. With the support of NASPEM, I plan these research forums to showcase the diverse research occurring within the organization with a specific goal to highlight the early career researchers within. So throughout the session today, if you could please keep your cameras and microphones off to limit the disruption. And if you have a question for the presenters today, please enter it within the chat to be addressed by the speaker. Any questions that are not addressed verbally by the speakers will be followed up with in the chat. To introduce both NASPEM and our keynote speaker for today's research forum, we have NASPEM President, Dr. Dawn Coe.
I just want to thank Christine and Ali for putting this research forum together. So NASPEM is really excited to sponsor this forum and to bring in some of our membership to see what's going on in different aspects of fields of pediatric exercise science. So as Christine said, I'm Dawn Coe. I'm the president, the current president of NASPEM. I'm at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I'll just give you a brief introduction to NASPEM. So we're an organization, relatively small organization, looking to grow our membership. And what we do is we promote exercise science, physical activity, fitness in health and medical care of children and adolescents. And so our group is very diverse. We have exercise physiologists, we have physicians, we have cardiologists. So a lot of different individuals doing multidisciplinary work in the field of pediatric exercise science. So we achieve a lot of our objectives through our biennial conference. So the next one is in 2022 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So Adam Baxter Jones will be hosting that meeting. Our website, I will post the website in the chat so you can look and get information about the meeting. We also have the journal that is the editor-in-chief of Pediatric Exercise Science. I know many individuals on this call are students, so we do have a student award and we'll be putting out a call for that as well. And so it's a good organization to network and get to know individuals in pediatric exercise science. There's also a link for membership. So if you want to join Sarah, you can contact Sarah Moore or join through our website. So I'm honored today to introduce Dr. Karin Pfeiffer. I figured out today that I've known Karin half of my life. So, about 10 years. Just kidding. Karin has been a colleague and friend since our time at Michigan State University. So she did her training at the University of Michigan as well as I did. And then her graduate training was at Michigan State University. She completed a postdoc at South Carolina and is currently a professor of kinesiology at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on population-based investigations, and so she has been conducting research in the area of physical activity measurement since I've known her and is truly an expert in this field. She also looks at physical activity interventions in different communities, so within the community, preschools, within the home, and so she does do a lot of work with preschool children. And so I think she's a great individual to start this research forum off with, and has a lot of connection throughout.
Appuyez sur le 0 pour choisir français. Dawn, you've gone muted.
Have I been muted the whole time? Okay. I think so. I think I got muted. So Karin is a longtime member of NASPEM and was a president, one of the presidents of NASPEM. So it's my honor to introduce and hear Karin speak today.
Thank you, Dawn. Let me get this started here. Okay, so again, thanks for the introduction, Dawn, and I would like to, on behalf of this fantastic panel, thank all of you for being here today. Also, thanks to Dawn and Christine and Allie for helping us get set up, and all of NASPEM for sponsoring these events. I think these are great. One thing that's nice about talking to a group such as this is I don't have to really spend much time explaining the benefits of physical activity to a group like this. And I'll just launch into talking a little bit about how over the past probably 10 to 15 years, it's become increasingly popular to start thinking about these preschool children and their physical activity. And we've gotten to the point where it's been important enough that they've entered into consideration for physical activity guidelines. So the US added preschoolers in their most recent rendition in 2018. And in those guidelines, the US gives a nod to the other guidelines that have existed in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And the US guidelines don't necessarily state a particular amount of time, but do give the nod to the other guidelines stating 180 minutes of total physical activity, which would incorporate light, moderate, and vigorous intensity physical activity. When we consider what's actually happening out there in the world, we get disparate results. For example, Pate and colleagues showed that about 50% of preschoolers were meeting guidelines in 2 US samples. And they did show as well that more boys are meeting guidelines than girls, and that seems to be fairly consistent across examinations. A sample in Australia had about 5% meeting guidelines, and then a sample in Portugal had about 90% meeting guidelines. And this seems like quite a wide variation, but when you consider the fact that there are several factors that might contribute to this, one, just simply being the fact that these children might be different in their behavior, but I don't think that accounts for the complete size of the difference. And one of the important factors to consider here is the measurement piece, and how variables are being measured, in this case, physical activity, can definitely affect your estimates of prevalence. And we all know from a paper from Beets and colleagues that the choice of cut points for accelerometer data certainly plays a role in determining the amount of minutes spent in physical activity, in addition to things like, are we assessing this based on each day's activity, or is it an average across days? Several factors related to measurement come into play when we're thinking about these sorts of behaviors. So we know that physical activity is important. We know we have a little bit of difference in how we might be assessing it. And one of the movements that's taken place in recent years, the last 3-4 years now, we've started thinking about more than just physical activity in terms of movement. And I would say this is a welcome change, that we are now considering 24-hour movement guidelines that take into account not just physical activity, but sleep and sedentary behavior as well. And so we do have some guidelines out there now for 24-hour movement, and the physical activity guideline piece of that has remained pretty much the same, about 180 minutes of total physical activity, all intensities. But now they also are talking about 60 of those minutes should be energetic, and more, of course, is better. When you examine meeting all of those guidelines for sleep, sedentary behavior, and physical activity, we're only getting about 9 to 13% across the board. And again, when considering these guidelines, measurement plays a role in our prevalence estimates. And now it's not just measurement of physical activity itself, but how we assess sleep and how we assess sedentary behavior as well. So measurement plays a role in all of these estimates. And I like the fact that we've moved to this 24-hour model. And I think that we have a little bit more work to do in terms of thinking about young children and movement. And so how do young children really move? Well, we all like to cite a paper out there that talks about short, sporadic bursts of physical activity for our young children. And what about those bursts? Are those bursts representative of what we might call moderate to vigorous physical activity? And does it even matter in this population? What about patterns? We don't really know about the pattern of movement. And that would be like, are they more active at particular times of the day, days of the week, those sorts of things? We're lacking information there. We're lacking information in the context in which physical activity occurs. This could include both social and environmental types of factors. What affordances are out there in the environment that help children to actually move? Who helps them move? We know a little bit about this, but not much. Additionally, we need skills, and we know that there are data that exist that tell us motor development and physical activity are related. And so how are they related? We don't have a great handle on all phases of childhood and adolescence, how this is the case. And in addition to that, we've also in recent years been considering physical literacy, which combines the motor competence piece with other variables such as fitness and perceived competence for activity. And it is important for us to consider how this total package of movement operates. Beyond that, related to the skills needed to move, we do have those with disability, and our guidelines don't incorporate any kind of information for children with disability. And in fact, we know probably the least about disability populations and movement, and we have a lot of work to do in this area. Some other areas where we could use more information is about structured versus unstructured activity. A lot of people believe that children need both, but how much of each? When should it happen? Risky play, Dr. Coe herself has done some work with risky play. We need that type of play to enhance development. And so this list is not exhaustive, but this is just to say it's more than, are we meeting guidelines for physical activity? It's more than how much physical activity are we getting of a certain intensity. It is about all different types of movement, because we know the way young children move is different from older children, which is different from adolescents, and they're all different from adults. And so interspersed among all of these, and this is not an exhaustive list either about the different types of measurement or movement to consider, is the topic of measurement. How do we assess all of these things? And the way we assess these things in turn affects our prevalence estimates, our relationships among variables, and our ability to examine the effects of interventions. So in order to address that today, we have our early career women with us, and all of the talks are going to have emphasis on measurement. Dr. Clevenger is going to speak to us a little bit about space and time in terms of the physical activity environment, particularly outdoors. Dr. Schenkelberg is going to speak to us about assessing especially the environment in movement in individuals with disabilities. Dr. Kara Palmer is going to tell us about motor competence, and we can assess that in a process-based manner or product-based manner. And she's going to talk to us about the product-based measures and what we need to consider. And Maeghan James is going to speak to us about a tool for assessing physical literacy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clevenger to tell us about her space and time considerations. Also, I just want to mention, as she's uploading her slides, again, as Christine mentioned, please put your questions in the chat. After each presentation, we'll try to take a question or two, and then the speakers will answer in the chat as well as when they're done with their presentations. So thank you all, and Kim, take it away.
Thanks, Karin. I'm going to be talking today about everyone's favorite part of the school or childcare day, recess. And I'm particularly interested in how we can design schoolyards or design recess periods to promote children participating in physical activity. And it kind of makes sense that children's physical activity participation isn't uniform across the schoolyard. Obviously, some locations are going to promote more or less physical activity. And we confirmed this idea by doing a systematic review. I cannot advance my slides. There we go. A systematic review of where children are physically active on the schoolyard. And this review showed us 6 studies in preschool age children. And the findings indicated that big open grassy fields, paths where children could ride tricycles or run, and fixed equipment were all locations where children were really physically active. Whereas locations like the sandbox or benches or other seating areas were less physically active. And that completely makes sense because these different areas afford different intensities of behavior. The problem with some of this early research is that we aren't able to capture some of these really specific and detailed differences in design that might impact children's physical activity levels. So for example, you might have a bigger or larger grassy field. You might have a newer or older piece of fixed equipment. And when we only study 1 or 2 schoolyards at a time, we're just not able to capture that level of detail. So what we need to do, of course, always more research needed, is replicate these studies in a larger sample of really diverse schoolyards. But to be able to do that, we probably can't rely on direct observation. That would be very tedious and difficult to get individual level data on a lot of schoolyards using direct observation. But research in older children and in adolescents has shown us that global positioning systems and accelerometry combined together can tell us where kids are being physically active on the schoolyard. So that might be a promising approach, although we haven't quite worked out the methods yet. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So we did a study comparing the different ways that you can analyze GPS and accelerometry data because everyone was kind of doing their own thing. And we concluded that probably the most promising method was something called hotspot analysis. And in hotspot analysis, you can identify statistically significant clusters of high accelerometer counts, hotspots, or statistically significant low accelerometer counts, cold spots, beyond what you would just see based on random chance. And this is really great because you can remove some of the noise in the data, but also let the data speak for itself and show you where those clusters are without you having to pre-identify what locations might be of interest. And it's also a statistical test, so you're not just looking at the dots and deciphering what you think might be an active location. However, a big limitation of this hotspot approach is that it only considers spatial information. So to be eligible to be in a cluster together, points just have to be located near each other physically in space. They don't have to be located near each other temporally. So the study I'm going to talk mostly about today aimed to compare this type of spatial only hotspot approach to a spatiotemporal approach. So just to be clear, the spatial only approach, you have all these individual little dots that are, accelerometer counts per 15 seconds, for example. And you're saying anything that's within, let's say, 3 meters of each other can be in a hotspot, a cluster, if the counts are high enough and clustered enough to be more than what we would see by chance. In a spatiotemporal approach, you can't just be located near each other physically. You also have to be located near each other temporally. So within 3 meters physically and within 3 minutes, for example, temporally. So this allows us to see not just where those clusters are located on the schoolyard, but also how that might change over the course of the recess period. So to do this, we had 34 kids in 3 different childcare centers who wore a GPS and an accelerometer for a whole day. So that ends up being 2 to 3 recess periods. And we used vector magnitude counts per 15 seconds as our outcome of interest that we were doing these hotspot analyses on. And the first thing I'll show you is what the spatial only approach shows us. This is just one schoolyard, one class. And you can see that this is an aerial picture of what the schoolyard looks like. And we have a hot spot on the fixed equipment, and we have a cold spot on the mulch. And this is what we would see if we just did what everyone else had done before. And what I'll show you next is what this looks like when we incorporate the temporal information. But hold on to your seats. This picture is going to be alarming at first. So imagine that we've taken this aerial picture of the schoolyard, and all we've done now is laid it down flat so that now it's three-dimensional. And you're standing on the schoolyard and you're looking north. That's this north view. And if you stand on the schoolyard and you look west, now you get this west view. And as we move up the graph, more time has elapsed. So this mulch cold spot happened earlier in the school time and the outdoor time than this hot spot on the fixed equipment. I'm going to move on to this though and show you a better example. In this class, they had 3 outdoor periods: a morning recess, lunch recess, and an afternoon recess. And what's really cool about this is these are the exact same kids on the exact same schoolyard on the exact same day. But during these 3 different recess periods, you can see that we have completely different cluster patterns. In the morning, we have kids kind of loitering here by the fence, watching all the other kids arrive at school, and we have a cold spot. At the end of the day, the kids have been cooped up inside. This is total speculation, but the kids have been cooped up inside for 4 hours. Now they come outside and they just have a hot spot the entire outdoor period. So this is really good evidence that we clearly need to capture both spatial location and time. Because if we only captured the spatial location, we'd be missing all of this really cool temporal variability. The other thing this shows us is that we don't just have variability within a recess period or intra-period variation, like you see in this lunch period, where the hot and the cold spot occur in the exact same place, but just at different times. We also have inter-period variability between the different recess periods. And the last thing I'll show you is just the average vector magnitude counts in each of these recess periods. I like this because it kind of shows us that if we just wanted to look at the temporal aspect, these are kind of the trends over time, the arrows, we would miss all of that cool spatial variation. So it's obvious that we need both of these things. I have to, of course, say that we need this on more schools. We only use 3. And I'd be really interested to do similar research, not just looking at clustering and physical activity, but at these other benefits of outdoor time, like Karin mentioned, risky play. And then lastly, I just want to give a shout out to all of our funders, particularly NASPEM. They provided funding for this. And in closing, remember, physical activity varies over both spatial location and over time. So it's important to capture both of those aspects.
Great, thank you, Kim. I checked the chat and I don't see any questions written in the chat so far. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions before we move on. And for time's sake, if you don't want to type, if you want to unmute and ask real quick, you could do that. And I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to ask you one, Kim, and then we're going to move on. So how do you think is really the best way for people to capture both space and time information when they may not be as familiar with how to do these methods?
I think that what's great about it is that you can get this information from whatever method you probably already use. Of course, with something like direct observation, you can observe location and you have the timing. With accelerometry, timing is already inbuilt into the data you get. You could add a GPS. It's very easy to analyze GPS data. We're hoping someday to make it even easier by, creating some sort of open source method for people to do that. But a lot of the existing methods for physical activity measurement already have this information. It's just not ignoring it is the important part.
Yeah, now there are some questions in the chat. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, so Kim will write responses, but I'm just going to ask you one more out of the chat, Kim. So can this method be combined with behavioral mapping, or is that a totally different thing?
No, that's what I mean. So I think I saw Dr. Costco actually in the list of participants who really pioneered a lot of this interesting work using behavioral mapping on where children are being physically active on the schoolyard. And this is the exact same thing. It's just a different method of getting the same information. So you can definitely get the same information from behavioral mapping.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Clevenger. We're going to turn it over now to Dr. Schenkelberg. And Dr. Clevenger will continue to answer the written questions in the chat as Dr. Schenkelberg is talking to us with lovely Lena in tow there.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my screen share. Of course, it was working in the introduction. And let me make sure that I've gotten it right. Okay, here it is, finally showing up. All right, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk with you more about assessing physical activity for children with disabilities. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. All of this work was conducted during my doctoral time at the University of South Carolina. And I will just say that this research project was funded by the Healthy Weight Research Network, as well as a graduate grant from the University of South Carolina. All right. So 1 in 6 children in the United States has a diagnosed developmental disability. And these include diagnoses such as autism or intellectual disability, global developmental delay, and they are often characterized by impairments in communication, daily living skills, learning, and mobility. And these impairments tend to persist into adulthood. And as we learned from Karin earlier on, physical activity is really beneficial for all children. We see really important cognitive and mental and emotional health outcomes, as well as physical health outcomes for both typically developing children as well as those with disabilities. And as many of us already know, and I will just reemphasize, these early childhood years are really instrumental for developing these lifelong physical activity habits that will promote activity throughout the span of a child's life. So oftentimes children with disabilities are excluded from the literature, but it has been encouraging to see that more and more researchers are investigating questions related to the physical activity patterns and types of children with developmental disabilities. So if we look to the literature to better understand what factors influence physical activity of those with disabilities, we see a variety of individual level factors such as age, disability status, and comorbidities, various levels of social and motor impairments, and that children who tend to have more considerable impairments in their motor skills or social skills tend to be less physically active compared to their peers. So when we look to kind of the broader social ecological model and examine some of those factors for the social and the physical environment, we see that the environment really does have an important component in terms of how physical activity is affected. So the literature has really focused on children with disabilities that are, I would say, in the adolescent to young adult age range. And we don't really know a lot about the preschool levels of physical activity. And so we wanted to further examine these questions about how active are preschoolers with disabilities. And we turned to the preschool setting because this is a setting in which a lot of children spend a considerable amount of time, even those with disabilities. So we needed to develop an instrument that would meet the needs of our research questions. And we specifically wanted to understand how the social and the physical environment influence physical activity level and behavior. So we conducted a series of literature reviews. We established content validity through numerous visits to preschool classrooms, both inclusive classrooms and special education settings. We interviewed directors and teachers and met with other experts in the field. And then through a variety of steps, which I'm not going to go into too much depth so I can have some time to explain application of this instrument, we decided which codes to retain, which codes to add. We piloted the instrument out and we field tested it to establish reliability. And then we made some slight modifications before it was published. So as you can see here, we've got a variety of little squares and they're color coded. So the red squares are related to physical activity, level, and behavior. So level was measured on a scale of 1 to 5, and this is really capturing intensity. This code was in category was drawn from the OSRAC-P, which is the Observational System for Recording Activity in Children preschool version. This is one of the very few direct observation instruments that has been used for children with disabilities. And then we have physical activity type, which is the type of movement that the child performed. We added a category to capture repetitive and stereotypic behavior. The green codes are basically telling us about the physical environment. So within the preschool setting, it's comprised of a variety of behavior settings, which are bound by time and space. So kids are active in these smaller segments of the day, and it varies by the actual physical location, whether they're indoors, outdoors, or in transition time. And then there's a variety of contextual circumstances that they can be physically active in. So things like group time or books or dramatic play, outdoors, like on the fixed playground equipment or an open space. And we added the therapy context to this instrument because therapy was a really important setting where a lot of children with disabilities were spending time both during the preschool day that was in a special ed setting, but also in an inclusive setting. The yellow outlined squares are referring to the social environment. So we looked at child-initiated activities, the group composition, so where in proximity that focal child was to other children. We examined engagement and interaction, and this was all based on an observation scale that specifically targeted engagement and interaction for children with disabilities in the early childhood setting. We also looked at physical activity prompts, where they came from, whether that was a teacher, a peer, or the therapist. So this observation system followed a momentary time sampling protocol. It was a 5-second observe, 25-second record period that was repeated over 20 minutes. So one observation session was 20 minutes in duration, and that means that it was comprised of 40 observation intervals. So I apologize, I don't know why the slides are being cut off here at the bottom, but we established reliability of this instrument in 19 preschool children, and this was both in a special ed and an inclusive classroom environment. So we observed the children for 137 observation sessions. We had over 5,000 observation intervals, and 28 of those sessions we established inter-rater reliability. So as you can see, we had high inter-rater reliability based off of percent agreement, as well as the kappa coefficients across all categories. So we then took this instrument and applied it to a larger sample. So we had 34 children who were eligible to participate in this study. The majority of them were male, which we typically do see in the disability literature. About 50% were non-Hispanic white, and the others were of various ethnic groups. We had 47.1% diagnosed with autism, and then we had about 53% who were considered more impaired in terms of their adaptive behavior. And this was determined using the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale. So we observed all of these children for a total of 11,310 coding intervals. And again, as you can see, we had high percent agreement and kappa values for reliability across observers. So this instrument was really useful because it not only allows us to measure the physical activity intensity, but we get a sense of the physical and the environmental context in which that activity occurs. So just to orient you, this is a very small percentage of data that came from our study. Children with disabilities were spending 81% of the time in a sedentary behavior during preschool, and only 2% of that time in moderate to vigorous activity. When we look to the indoor context, this is a setting which is very sedentary as well, and they were sedentary for about 87.9% of the time. And in the outdoor setting, they were sedentary for only 59.9% of the time. And you can see that moderate to vigorous activity was quite a bit more in the outdoor setting, and total physical or light physical activity was 30% in the outdoor context as well. So as Karin had mentioned, we really care about total physical activity for preschoolers, and we can just sum these two together to get a sense of what that total level is like. So we conducted some more complex analyses. We used logistic regression to examine the likelihood that a child was being active or was engaging in total physical activity based off of different settings and the environmental circumstances. So children were more active when they were performing repetitive or stereotypic behavior, almost twice as likely to be active when they were engaged in those behaviors. almost 5 times more likely to be physically active when they were outdoors compared with indoors, and about 5.6 times more likely when they were in a therapy setting compared to group time, 3 times more likely when they were in an open space compared to fixed equipment, and then basically 2 to 3.5 times more likely when they were either solitary or interacting one-on-one with a small group or with an adult or a peer compared to in a larger group with an adult present. So we tended to find that they were more active when they were actually interacting or when they were alone. So in summary, children with disabilities were more active in settings during which they are not managed by adults. And this is very consistent with what we found in typically developing literature as well. If you let children play, they're going to play and they're going to be physically active. And we saw this in the example of how children were more active outdoors compared to indoors. We also found that therapy was the indoor setting that was the most supportive of physical activity. In these contexts, the children were often working one-on-one with a therapist, and they were in a larger environment with resources available to them, all of which are factors that we know correlate to physical activity in typically developing kids. And so we're seeing very similar patterns for those with disabilities. We also found that smaller groups seem to promote more physical activity, and the OSRAC-DD is a reliable instrument to assess this physical activity and environmental factors during the preschool day. So I think this entire project really speaks to how much more similar children with disabilities are, and how we really need to work to be more inclusive in our research to make sure that we're creating environments that are more supportive of physical activity for children with and without disabilities. So I can see this tool being used in intervention research, further in observational research, comparing children with and without disabilities across settings, and then also looking at how these settings are interacting to relate or influence physical activity. So just brief acknowledgements to the Children's Physical Activity Research Group and my mentors at USC. Jane Roberts in the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Lab at South Carolina, my research assistant, and participating preschools and children. Both these papers are published, so you can find them and learn more, or feel free to ask some questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna limit this to one question out of the chat now, seeing how we're doing on time. There was a question about if the instrument's available to other researchers, and I believe the answer to that is yes. Is that correct, Michaela?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so South Carolina, I know, has been working to move everything onto their website for the Children's Physical Activity Research Group. But if it's not easily findable, then feel free to reach out to me and I will send it your way.
Yeah, and then just one other question, and then you can visit the chat, Michaela, and address. There are a couple other ones in there. Were the resources for the children, did they include adaptive or adapted materials?
No, so there was very little adaptive resources that were provided. So a lot of what we saw were just typical playground equipment that was being brought out. There weren't even any specialized like motor skill development programs that were being done in these settings as well.
So, okay, thank you, Michaela. Please do visit the chat, and there are a couple other questions about the diagnoses and things in there for you to answer. And next up, we're gonna have Dr. Kara Palmer speak to us about product-oriented measures of motor competence. So Kara?
All right, is everything shared, Karen? We can
Yes.
see? Perfect, thank you. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking to you today on my research and some of the work I'm doing with great colleagues about using product-oriented motor skill measures to assess motor competence in young children. Specifically, we're going to look at feasibility and developmental appropriateness. So the point of this talk is to really talk about motor competence. And when I'm speaking about motor competence, I'm talking about children's gross motor competence and how well they propel their bodies through space or how well they propel or manipulate objects in space. When we look and we try to determine a child's motor competence levels, we typically use one of two different approaches to measurement. So we use what's called a product-oriented measure, which we would look at the outcome of the movement itself. So in the example seen here, we have this young gentleman who's measuring the jump performance through distance. So he's looking at the outcome of this child's jump. We could also look at process-oriented measures of motor competence. So instead of looking at how far this child jumps, we could look at how this child jumps. And we typically do this by scoring a child by the presence or absence of specific skill criteria, as seen here. There's been recent work that supports that product and process motor measures relate but are unique, and they're going to give us different information about a child's motor competence overall. So I've highlighted these two papers. There's other work out there as well. The majority of this work has been done in older children, so 5 and up. And so we were interested in looking at these product measures in preschool age children, so starting at age 3. So we looked at using product scores in that population. We're going to take a battery of 6 product scores. So we look at children's throwing and kicking speed, which is measured as in miles per hour using a radar gun. We look at catching percentage, which was the number of balls a child caught out of 5 trials. We look at jump distance, which was seen on the previous slide, the number of centimeters that a child completed during a forward jump. And then we also look at running speed and hopping speed, which we measured as meters per second, and that was calculated using the Dartfish video analysis software. Once we collected these measures, we were interested in looking at how do process and product-oriented measures relate in this population. And so we took a sample, we collected data on about 300 children, about 4 years of age. We did the test of gross motor development as our process measure, and we did that battery of 6 skills as our product measure. We then just used simple correlations, Pearson's and Spearman rank correlations, to look at the relationship between these two measures. I'm going to separate out the results and discuss first locomotor and then ball skills. So the 3 locomotor skills that we assessed were the jump, the run, and the hop. For some of these, you get multiple product measures. So for instance, like a child completed 5 jump trials. And so we took a max trial, an average top 5 trial, and an average top 3 trial. And we looked to see how those particular product scores related to process. And so the process scores are listed here on the top. We looked at subtest rank, so locomotor TGMD subtest rank and total TGMD rank. So these were scores that range from 0 to 100. Then we also looked at how product measures related to individual raw score. So for the jump, we have these 3 measures, the max out of 5 trials, the average out of 5 trials, and the top 3. And what you can see is that we have correlation values for subtest and TGMD total rank at about 0.3, and the individual raw skill score of, again, about 0.3. For the run, we just took an average meter per second score across 2 run trials, and we see that the relationship to process measures is again in that 0.3, 0.4 range. For the hop, we looked at average hopping speed and maximal hopping speed between 2 hop trials on the preferred and on the non-preferred foot, as well as a total average across all hopping trials. Results vary slightly here. We see that for the subtest rank and the total TGMD rank, the correlational values between product and process are again 0.4. However, when you look at the individual skill score, the correlation values are higher, with the preferred foot being about a 0.7 and the non-preferred being about a 0.5. So overall, we see that there's small to moderate correlations between product and process measures, and that different product measures similarly relate to process measures, the exception here being the hop. The hop, we expected the preferred foot to have a higher correlation with TGMD raw score because the TGMD is only scored on the preferred foot. Looking at ball skills, we looked at the throw, the kick, and the catch. We again, for the throw and the kick, we're going to have a maximum trial out of 5, an average out of 5, and an average out of top 3. For the throw, we see the correlational values are slightly higher. So between the subtest and the total, about a 0.5, 0.4, but the individual skill score correlations are back to that 0.3 range. For the kick, again, for the subtest and the total, we see the correlation values of about 0.4, and then for the individual skill score, again, that 0.3 range. And then catching, we looked at the percentage of balls caught out of 5 trials, as well as the percentage of balls caught out of the TGMD test trials. And we found that the subtest rank was about 0.3. The individual skill score correlation was about 0.3, but that total TGMD rank was slightly lower at about 0.2 or 0.1. So again, looking at just ball skills, we have small to moderate correlations between process and product measures. We see that these different measures of product motor competence similarly relate to process. The exception here is the catch. And I won't go into why I think that is, but I do have some justification for that as well. So it looks like we can take product measures in young children. It looks like there are low to moderate correlations between process and product in young children, which we expected based on the previous literature. We were then interested in how then do product measures assess changes in motor skills or motor competence across an intervention. So for this research, we did a sample of 65 children. We did the same motor skill measures as previously, but now we've inserted an intervention. So we did a 1,300 minute motor skill intervention. And we looked at the correlation between process and products before, after, and across the intervention. We handled the data also a little differently for this one. We created aggregate measures. So instead of just looking at the individual skills as we did in the previous research, we now combined our product measures to give us a locomotor measure, a ball skill measure, and a total measure. What we see from this particular sample is that at each singular time point, so at pre-test and post-test, there was a moderate to strong relationship between process and product skills for locomotor, ball skills, and total. But if you look at the change, there's no relationship between product and process changes in motor competence across the intervention. If you look at it by individual skill, we see a similar pattern where you see at the pre-test and at post-test, so at singular time points, there's a moderate correlation between process and product measures, but the change is only related for certain skills, so it's only going to be related for the catch, the kick, and the hop. We were also interested in not only how do process and product relate within an intervention context, but can you use product skills to evaluate intervention effects? So for the same data set, for this particular data set, the process measures were all significantly changed across the intervention. However, when we look at the product measures, we kind of see a different pattern of findings emerge. So here on the left, you can see all the different product measures we took. Here at the bottom, we have those aggregate locomotor, ball skill, or total product measures. And these did not significantly change across the motor intervention. However, when we looked at individual skills, we did see significant changes in the throw, the kick, and the hop across the intervention. So kind of taking it all together, what I think this research means, and this is kind of an ongoing thing in our lab right now, is I think that through our data collection process and through just the correlational values between product and process, it is feasible to use product-oriented measures to measure motor competence in young children. However, the appropriateness of this measure appears to be dependent on context. So if you're trying to evaluate intervention change, perhaps a product measure will yield different information than a process measure. Future directions for this work, one thing that's really important to consider is the developmental processes in play here. And so there's a lot of thought that how we change how a child moves or a process approach will then change the outcome or the product of their movement. None of this data encapsulates that particular developmental process, so that's an area for future examination. Further, we just looked at a max and average scores for children's product measures. It could be that if we're having them throw for 5 trials, what might be of interest is not a max score or an average score, but rather the variability or the reliability among those scores. Are they throwing consistently? And so examining variability as a metric is an area for future research as well. We also need to examine how these different orientations to motor skill measurement relate to health outcomes, particularly to this panel, perhaps physical activity, and then of course, replicating in different populations. So with that, I would like to thank NASPEM for having me today, my collaborators, my funders, and the students and teachers and parents who participated in this research.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara. So we do have one question so far in the chat that I will ask you now, and then you can answer any others that arise. So from Ryan, given the popularity of the TGMD and feasibility of product measures, would you recommend that we come up with testing procedures for product measures for the other TGMD skills not assessed in this study?
Ooh, interesting question, Ryan. I think that this work shows that there's value in product measures. And so I think that it is worth our time to try to figure out product measures that could relate to other outcomes with the TGMD as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kara.
Thank you.
So she will be answering any other questions in the chat. I see at least one for you there, Kara. And then next up, we have almost Dr. James, and she's going to talk to us about a physical literacy assessment tool. Take it away, Maeghan.
Sorry about that, just a technical difficulty. Let me try to bring that back up here. All right, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I know we're running a little bit close to the 1 o'clock mark there, but my name is Maeghan James. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about a physical literacy tool designed for the preschool years. And this was a project I was lucky enough to work on a few years back, and the research study team is up on the screen there. So just before I get into the kind of main findings from this work, I wanted to quickly introduce physical literacy. So physical literacy is really a holistic concept that takes into account the motivation, confidence, physical competence, knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activities for life. So as you've heard today, and we all already know, physical activity is really important to broader health outcomes. And physical literacy is one determinant that we know to impact physical activity. So on the screen here is a conceptual model proposed by Dr. John Kearney and colleagues, and this shows really how physical literacy is a process that spans across all developmental periods. And physical literacy has been shown to increase engagement in physical activity, which in turn can result in a positive cascade of events, resulting in improvements in physical, mental, and social health. So it's evident that physical literacy is important. And in recent years, there has been a shift in interventions and programs that really are targeting physical literacy in children. So therefore, we need to be able to measure physical literacy, and efforts have been made to design measurement tools in order to do this. So for example, the play measures that were developed by
Maeghan, I'm just not sure about your sound. Sorry to interrupt, but could you just check your sound, your volume?
Karin, can you try to fix the audio problem?
Unfortunately, that is not under my control or any of the webinar folks' control. Maeghan, can you hear us?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. We haven't been able to hear you the last couple slides.
I'm so sorry. I don't know.
I don't know what happened.
No problem. What slide did I leave off on? I can probably just skim through to make sure we're not missing anything.
Go back. Let's see. One more. Maybe you lost it on the one right before this one.
Maybe this one.
Yeah.
Well, you know what?
Oh, you just cut out again. You might want to check your headphones. Check the jack for your headphones or something.
Sorry, I'm not sure what's flipping back and forth. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I just came off to check my sound, but I don't see anything here. So I'll put this back up. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so just for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip ahead here to the tool. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what is flipping around on the mic. So I'm just going to dive into the tool a little bit here to give you an idea of what the tool looks like. So beginning with the movement competencies section of the tool, early childhood educators are first asked to choose the box in which they think best matches the child's skills. And then they're asked to place a vertical line within that box in order to indicate where the child fits along that line there. For coordinated movements, the ECEs are asked to rate the children on a scale of 1 to 4, so from never to always, and they're just asked to place an X in the box that best describes the child. For motivation and enjoyment, similarly, they're rating on a 5-point Likert scale now, and again asked to place an X in the box that best describes them. Lastly, for overall physical literacy, they're back on this visual analog scale, and they're asked to place a vertical line to indicate their physical literacy levels. So here's a snapshot of what the kind of study looked like. In order to test the reliability and validity of the tool, we randomly assigned children to 2 early childhood educators, and each of the educators took part in a 2-week observation period and then scored the children on their pre-play assessment tool. So this allowed us to look at inter-rater reliability, or the agreement between assessors. Following this, each of the ECs completed another observation period and then completed the assessment again. And this allowed us to look at the retest reliability, or intra-rater reliability. Lastly, to look at the validity of the tool, research assistants went in and they conducted a measurement of gross motor skills. So we used the Peabody developmental motor scale. And then we also looked at physical activity. So if you think back to the model, we were proposing that physical literacy would be predictive of physical activity. We only hypothesized moderate effects here, but we included physical activity as a measure to look at that. So just for the sake of time, I'll now I'm catching on. I get a notice from Zoom saying something that I'm muted, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry about that. So on the screen here is the results from the inter-rater reliability measures. And quickly going through these, you can see that the reliability is much stronger for females compared to males. But when looking at intra-rater reliability, so the test-retest agreement, we're seeing good to excellent correlations for the total pre-play score, movement competence, motivation, and enjoyment. But again, with coordinated movements, the results were not as strong. And then looking at validity, so for comparing it to the PDMS2, we were using correlations. And we're only seeing significant correlations between the total pre-play score and the movement competence section of the tool. And that, again, was only for females. And then lastly, we conducted a series of mixed effects models to look at how predictive the pre-play tool was of physical activity. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the left-hand column of this chart here of total physical activity. So beginning with the total pre-play score, we're seeing a moderation effect of sex. And when we break it down, we're seeing that the pre-play total score is predictive of physical activity, but only in females. And then for movement competence, a similar trend here where there's a moderating effect of sex. For females, movement competence is approaching significance, but for males, it is not. And then for coordinated movements, we do not see a moderation effect here. And for the motivation and enjoyment scale, again, a moderating effect of this scale on physical activity, and this is only for females. So the results from this study, this study was the first study that tested a physical literacy instrument developed for preschool age children. And it showed us adequate reliability and evidence of validity for females, but poor reliability and validity for males. The results from this study could be indicative of a potential sex bias. Previous research has shown that teachers tend to overestimate skill level for boys and underestimate skill level for girls. So this may be playing a role here as well. In addition, EC's knowledge of motor development could have impacted these results, but unfortunately we did not collect data on the years of training or experience as an ECE. So this is something that future research should really explore. And then the results from this study also highlight the importance of training. So the training that we conducted for this study was focused on how to use the tool and also how to ensure opportunities to observe the child. But these sex differences that are coming out are really showing that there may be need for training in terms of the differences in motor development between boys and girls. So in conclusion, the pre-play tool shows promise, at least for girls, but more work is needed to refine the tool. And we really should continue focusing on the best practices for measuring physical literacy in the early years. So with that, I would like to apologize for all the technical difficulties. I'm sure we're probably not enough time for questions, but my email's up there, my Twitter handle's up there. I'd love to connect with you. Thank you.
So Maeghan, nicely done in the face of your technical difficulties.
That's never happened before.
So we do have one question. Why don't you go ahead and answer one question now? Do you believe there will be a statistical difference in the measure of PMC used regardless of the context?
Sorry, for PMC.
I think that question was directed at me. Karin.
Okay, I was like, I'm not sure.
Oh, perceived motor competence. Yeah.
I see. That makes sense.
It just popped up, so I read it. So Maeghan, I don't see a question right now. Maybe some will pop up in here before I do my summary. Let me just ask you one quick one.
Sure.
So why do you think you're seeing this difference for boys versus girls in this instrument? And are there any clues in, there are the other physical literacy tools for older youth, what does that come into play? Anything related to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And something we're exploring. We're still doing some follow-up studies on this work. One thing I didn't really have time to go over is that when we actually looked at the differences in motor skills in the boys and girls in our sample, we didn't see any differences. There's no significant differences between their motor skills. So our thinking is that this is likely attributed to these sex biases that we do see in the literature, and that this may be coming out in these results as well. So they may not be accurately assessing the motor skills for boys in this sample. We also discussed behavioral difficulties that we see more so in boys, and this has also been shown to play a role in how you assess and how you observe motor competence. So we think that this may also be playing a role in the way that we're kind of suggesting that we can address this is through this training. And we heard this from the ECs as well, that they would like more training. They don't get a lot of formal training in motor development specifically, especially around the differences in boys and girls. So this could be one way that we address that gap.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I know we are a little bit over time here, but I'm just going to give you about a minute and a half summary of what we learned today. And our takeaway messages are, first of all, from Dr. Clevenger, it is important to capture both spatial and temporal information relative to, in this case, the recess or outdoor physical activity, but we need to consider location and timing together, not just separately. From Dr. Schenkelberg, we learned about identifying the environmental correlates of physical activity among the children with developmental disabilities and how that might help us inform modifications we could make to the environment. Dr. Palmer showed us that it is feasible to use product-oriented measures of motor competence in preschoolers, but the appropriateness of using those measures could depend on the context. And so it looked a little less effective for an intervention context, for example. And then we learned that the pre-play really is the first observation tool out there for physical literacy in preschool children. And it has shown some promise of its utility, especially in girls, but we have a little bit of work to do for boys. And overall, just a reminder, we wanted to highlight elements of movement in preschool children that have not been examined as much, but are important. And so we looked at things like context today. We looked at motor skills. We looked at populations with disabilities. And we looked at the total package of physical literacy, not just motor competence on its own. There, for all of you even earlier career than our presenters out there, there's a lot of work to be done in this area. And, the emphasis on measurement here today was deliberate, because sometimes we forget about the fact that measurement plays such a role in understanding how variables are working and what's really happening in populations. And so even though, as someone who's been studying measurement for my entire career, I will tell you it's not always like woohoo, the hot thing to do, but it's very important and central to our work in order to learn more moving forward. So again, I wanted to just thank everybody for being here today, and especially thank our fabulous presenters. You all did a great job. And thanks again to NASPEM for having us. Christine or Allie, I don't know if you had more to say.
I might just jump in there and once you're done sharing, say thank you again as well to all for attending. And our next session will be coming up on April 30th. So there will be more announcements to follow to advertise that session as well. Thank you, everyone.